I thought my wife was just cheating on me until I followed her to a desolate warehouse and discovered she was orchestrating a murder I was being framed for. Now, the man who was supposed to be dead is holding a gun to my head, and I realize the life I've been living was never mine to begin with. The silence in our living room didn't feel empty. It felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. My wife, Elena, was standing by the window, the soft glow of the street lamp casting long, jagged shadows across her face. She was holding her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen, her breathing just a fraction too steady to be natural. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally thin in the quiet. She jumped, a sharp, involuntary movement that she tried to mask by smoothing out the fabric of her skirt. "Fine," she said, not turning around. "Just work. Another emergency at the firm. They're running me ragged, babe." I nodded, though a cold, sharp needle of doubt had already pierced my chest. I knew she was lying. I knew it because I wasn't supposed to be home, and more importantly, I wasn't supposed to have seen the notification that had lit up her screen 3 minutes ago. It wasn't a work email. It was a message from an anonymous contact. No name, just a string of numbers, containing a single, chilling set of coordinates and a timestamp for an hour from now. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a drink I didn't want, and listened to the floorboards creak as she scurried toward the bedroom. I watched from the shadows of the hallway as she grabbed her coat, her movements frantic, the polished veneer of her tired corporate lawyer persona cracking under the pressure of whatever secret she was keeping. She slipped out the front door, leaving the house in a silence that now screamed. I waited 10 seconds, grabbed my keys, and followed her into the freezing night, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure, unadulterated dread. I tracked her silver sedan through the winding streets of the suburbs, keeping 2 cars back, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. She wasn't heading toward the law firm in the city center. She was heading toward the docks, a desolate stretch of industrial decay where people went when they didn't want to be found. As she pulled into the gravel lot of a rusted, abandoned warehouse, I killed my headlights and rolled to a stop behind a stack of shipping containers. I watched her step out, her silhouette small against the imposing, dark structure. She wasn't alone. A tall, shadowed figure emerged from the darkness to meet her, and the way they stood, the intimacy of their proximity, made my stomach churn. I reached into my glove box, pulling out the small, black device I'd spent 3 weeks preparing. I checked the screen. It was live. Everything she said, every muffled word, was being piped directly into my headset. I braced myself, praying I was wrong, praying this was just some bizarre mistake, as she reached out and touched the stranger's hand. Then, the audio crackled to life, and the first thing I heard wasn't a confession of infidelity, but the sound of my own name being spoken, with a chilling, calculated malice. "He suspects nothing," she whispered into the cold night air. "But we have to move the timeline up. If he finds the documents in the floor safe before midnight, he'll know exactly who killed his father." I froze, the blood draining from my face so quickly I felt dizzy. I hadn't even known my father's death was a murder, let alone that my own wife was the one who had orchestrated it. I sat in the dark, trembling, watching as she reached into her bag and handed the stranger a manila envelope. The very one I had been searching for all month. I had to move. I had to confront her. But as I opened my door, the sound of a heavy metal bolt sliding home echoed across the yard. The warehouse door swung open wide, and 3 more men stepped out, their faces obscured by ski masks. They weren't looking at Elena. They were looking directly at my car, their weapons raised, as if they had known I was sitting there the entire time. The realization hit me harder than a physical blow. I wasn't the hunter. I was the bait. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, slamming against my chest as the 3 men began to move with a predatory, coordinated efficiency toward my hiding spot. I didn't think. I reacted. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning violently against the wet gravel, and slammed the accelerator. The vehicle screeched backward, narrowly missing the edge of a container before I swung the wheel and tore out of the lot, dust and stones spraying behind me. In the rearview mirror, I saw Elena. She wasn't running to help them. She was standing perfectly still, her face illuminated by the distant floodlights, her phone held to her ear. She was watching me flee, with the detached observation of a scientist watching a lab rat scurry through a maze. She hadn't even flinched when the shots rang out, the pop, pop, pop of suppressed gunfire thudding into the trunk of my car like dull hammer blows. I pushed the sedan to its breaking point, weaving through the industrial maze of the docks, my mind racing faster than the engine. If she knew about my father, if she knew about the floor safe, then the life I had built over the last 5 years was nothing but a hollow stage set, a play directed by a woman I had trusted with my soul. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking violently, intending to call the police, but the screen blinked a warning. No service. She had jammed the signal. Of course she had. She was a partner at one of the most powerful firms in the state. She had the resources to erase me, and she had clearly spent years setting the stage for this exact moment. I turned onto the main highway, hoping to hit a populated area, but the road ahead was blocked. A black SUV sat idling directly across the center line, its headlights blindingly bright, turning the night into a wall of white glare. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding sideways until it came to a screeching halt just feet away from the heavy bumper. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. No one exited the SUV. No one fired a shot. They were just waiting, forcing me to sit there in the dark, stewing in my own terror. I looked at the passenger seat where I'd left my bag, my hand brushing against the hard plastic of the voice recorder. I had the evidence. I had the confession. But it was useless if I didn't survive the next 5 minutes. Suddenly, my phone screen flickered to life. A single text message from an unknown number filled the display. It wasn't a threat. It was a photo. It was a picture of me, taken from inside our home, while I was sleeping in bed last night. And underneath it, a short, terrifying caption. The safe is already empty, darling. And look behind you. A cold sweat broke over my skin, prickling like needles. I didn't want to look, but my gaze was drawn slowly to the rearview mirror. In the darkness of the back seat, where there should have been nothing but shadows and the occasional stray grocery bag, a pair of eyes caught the dim glow of the dashboard lights. A hand, gloved in black leather, reached up from the floorboards and slowly began to wrap its fingers around the headrest of my driver's seat. The interior of the car transformed from a sanctuary into a tomb. Every hair on my neck stood at attention as the pressure on the headrest increased, the leather groaning under the force of the grip. I didn't dare turn around. If I moved, if I acknowledged the intruder, the game would be over. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my fingernails dug into the padding, my breath hitching in a shallow, jagged rhythm. "Don't," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. The intruder didn't speak. Instead, a metallic click echoed through the cabin, the unmistakable sound of a safety being disengaged. The barrel of a pistol pressed firmly against the base of my skull, cold and unforgiving. "Drive," a voice rasped from the back seat. It wasn't the voice of the men from the warehouse. It was deeper, distorted by a mechanical filter, stripping away any hint of humanity. "Follow the SUV, and keep your hands where I can see them, or I promise you won't even feel the end." I shifted the car into gear, my movements mechanical and fluid with terror. The black SUV ahead of us finally moved, pulling slowly onto the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking in a rhythmic, taunting pulse. I followed, trailing them toward the outskirts of town, toward the dense, suffocating woods that bordered the old estate my father had owned before he died. As we drove, my mind clawed at the edges of reality. The safe was empty. That meant the files were gone. Everything I had worked for, Every shred of leverage I had meticulously hoarded against the day I realized my wife wasn't who she claimed to be had been compromised. She had played me. She had let me believe I was the one pulling the strings, let me play detective while she dismantled my life piece by piece. We reached the entrance to the estate, the iron gates standing open like the jaws of a beast. The SUV turned down the overgrown gravel driveway, disappearing into the wall of black trees. I followed, the gravel crunching loudly under my tires. As we rounded the final bend, the moonlight broke through the canopy, illuminating the house. It was a skeleton of a building, blackened by a fire that had happened years ago. The same fire that had claimed my father's life. My pulse spiked. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a theater of trauma. The SUV stopped in front of the charred porch. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, his face obscured by the darkness, but his posture was unmistakable. It was my father's old business partner, a man who had been dead for 3 years, or so we were told at the funeral. "Out," the voice behind me commanded. I opened the door and stepped onto the crumbling driveway, my legs feeling like lead. I held my hands up, the cold night air biting at my skin. The man from the SUV walked toward me, his face finally visible in the flicker of the porch light. He looked older, gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by secrets, but he was undeniably alive. "You always were too curious for your own good, just like him," he said, gesturing toward the ruin of the house. I looked past him, scanning the darkness for Elena, but she was nowhere to be seen. My stomach dropped. I realized then that she hadn't just betrayed me, she had orchestrated this entire reunion. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, but a soft, familiar voice drifted from the shadows of the porch. "He's here, just like you promised," Elena said, stepping into the light. She wasn't wearing her work clothes anymore. She was wearing a heavy trench coat, and in her hand, she held a familiar, worn leather briefcase. The very one my father had been clutching the night he burned to death. She walked toward me, a sad, pitying smile on her lips, and stopped just inches away. She reached out, running a hand down my cheek with a tenderness that made me want to scream. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," she whispered, her eyes devoid of anything resembling love. "But we needed the key to open it, and you, my darling, were the only one who could provide it." Before I could process her words, the man behind me reached out and grabbed my wrist, twisting it sharply. I felt a sharp, burning prick in my forearm, and my vision began to swim. My knees buckled, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of gray and black. As I collapsed toward the frozen gravel, I saw Elena kneel beside me, holding my hand against the lock of the briefcase. "It's a biometric scanner," she murmured, her voice sounding as if it were coming from under a mile of water. "It needs a heartbeat to function. Yours." As my consciousness began to fray at the edges, the briefcase clicked. The lid creaked open, and the faint, unmistakable smell of ozone and burnt paper drifted out. I tried to look inside, to see what was worth destroying my life for, but my eyelids were too heavy. Then, a sound cut through the ringing in my ears, not a shot, but a siren. A low, mournful wail that grew louder with every passing second. Elena's eyes widened, and she stood up, looking toward the driveway. She looked at me, then at the case, and then, with a look of pure, unadulterated shock, she turned toward the darkness behind the house and screamed. "They weren't supposed to find us here." The sirens weren't just wailing, they were screaming, a cacophony of red and blue light bleeding through the dense tree line like a strobe-lit nightmare. Elena's mask of composure had completely dissolved, replaced by a jagged, feral panic I had never seen on her face before. She shoved the briefcase into the arms of the man who had been dead for 3 years, her eyes darting between the encroaching police cruisers and the dark, rotting maw of the forest. I tried to crawl toward them, but my limbs felt like they were filled with wet sand. The sedative was fighting my central nervous system, turning my frantic thoughts into sludge. "Get him!" Elena hissed at the man. "If they find him alive, we're finished. Kill him and run for the extraction point." The man hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the flashing lights that were now illuminating the driveway in rhythmic, violent bursts. He looked down at me, a man who had once been my father's most trusted confidant, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something that wasn't malice,